Hello, David Clarke here from DVC Training. In this video, I'll be looking at DaVinci Resolve and in particular some interesting things I found out about the export panel. Obviously, I'm using a PC. I would assume a lot of this stuff applies on a Mac too, but obviously I'm looking at it from the PC side. I'm assuming that you're familiar with the basics. Obviously, you come in here, you choose some settings, click Add to Render Queue, and then click the Render button. And obviously, there's a lot of different types of files that you can use in here. The idea here is not going to be explaining the basics, it's a few other little things that I've noticed over my time in using it. So, for a start, on the file name, you get the file name up here, which you can type in, or if you go to the file heading here, you can choose to keep a custom name, which you can type up there or down there, or you can stick the timeline name is. I quite like that one because it means when I'm rendering out a timeline, it actually gives me the name of the timeline on the clip. The only downside of that is it's always called that name. So if I did Squirrel version 1, my timeline is called Squirrel. So if I did Squirrel version 1, and then I saved out a new timeline and it's called Squirrel version 2, if I use that, it's always going to be called Squirrel. So I'll just go and overwrite the old one, and maybe I want to keep different versions. In which case, I was always going to custom name and then typing the words in. What you can do though, and this is something I only found out quite recently actually, was that instead of typing something, if you type the % key first, it gives you a list of different things that can go straight into that field. So I'm going to type timeline, and as soon as I start typing that, it gives me the option of everything with time in, and I'm going to choose timeline name. And then if I add it to the render queue, you'll notice it goes in here with the name of the timeline as the name. I haven't clicked that. I've put in this thing by putting % and then timeline name. And then I can add on to it stuff like that. So that's now going to go timeline name v1. If I'm going to do this again, I'll change that to a 2, bonk, and I'll have timeline version 2. So I just like that because you don't have to type the flipping words all the time. It can take the name of the timeline and you can just add extra bits onto it. And of course, it's not just the name of the timeline. As I said there are loads of stuff. And you could even stack them up. So I could come in here and put in the genre, and then that will give a name with a genre at the end of it. I haven't actually given anything to the genre, so there's nothing there. But you can put in all sorts of different things. You don't want that, just delete it. Simple little thing, but actually that saves me quite a lot of time when I'm doing different versions of the timelines. And you can save that as part of a preset. So any settings that you put in here, you can save as a preset. You do that by clicking on these little dots and going to save as preset. You can see I've actually got quite a lot of different ones here for different things that I do. And I can just save a new one by just saying save as preset and calling it. And now I've got a preset up there called timeline name. I can go to any of my others and then back to timeline name, and it's remembered that as part of it, plus all the other settings of what kind of file I was making and so on. So I think that's great. I think that's a nice little thing which I only just found out about. Another useful thing, which is kind of similar to that, is to do with the resolution and the frame rate. Sometimes I'll be in a project. Let's just change the project settings. So I'm going to go down here and just load up a different preset. And here I've got a preset which is 1440 by 1080. That's me doing some stuff with some square video. I would come over to here and I would choose a preset like this one, and I would add to render queue, and then it would say, what, do you want to do a higher resolution than render mush? Because this preset happens to be high definition, 1920 by 1080. This timeline is 1440. I got that quite a lot, and I just had to cancel and go back and blah, blah. And that was irritating. I think this, again, is a recent addition, but what I tend to do now is I'll come in here, and instead of choosing a resolution for my timeline, I'm going to come in here, and you'll notice it pops up with custom and then all this other stuff. Actually, what I want is above custom. I'd seen this once, and I went back looking for it, and I couldn't see it because I was scrolling down and down and down the list, and it wasn't there. It's actually above the word custom, and it's this thing, timeline resolution. Now, if I do that and I save that as a preset, then the actual resolution of the final clip will vary depending on the timeline settings, and I won't get that annoying message, just like so. So, in fact, I want to take this preset that I've made of GVAVI only and update it so it says timeline resolution instead of 1920 1080. Very easy. You just come to here, GV only, update, and now that's saved, so it'll always be at timeline resolution instead of 1920 1080. And I like that. I also like this one, frame rate, setting it to the timeline frame rate. Most of the time when you export a timeline, it's going to be the same rate as the timeline, so I don't really want to put in something specific. I like having that in there and then saving it as a preset, and then that will adjust to whatever the frame rate is of the timeline that I'm doing. So for example, tutorials, done at 30 frames a second, because that matches better what a computer screen is. My own videos done at 25 or 50 frames a second. Well, if this is set to timeline frame rate, and then I save that as a preset, that'll adapt to whatever the timeline is. So again, that's another nice little one that it took me ages to notice even existed. And the biggest thing was when I knew it existed, and I went back to look for it later on, I couldn't find the flipping thing. And that was because when you click on the list here, it was coming up there. Timeline resolution was above it. But that I find very, very useful. Now, talking of presets and types of files and that kind of thing, I do use this a lot, Grass Valley AVI files. Grass Valley obviously make Edius. If you're a Resolve person, you may not even have ever used Edius. So you might look at Grass Valley in there and say, why on earth would I bother to use Grass Valley as a codec? Suppose you're using this and you're using Premiere. Grass Valley codec is not something Premiere will understand out of the box. You can make it understand it just by downloading something free from Grass Valley, a codec pack. But you might say to yourself, why would I ever bother to use it? I do happen to use Edius, so obviously it makes sense for me. But I think it makes sense anyway, because there's a lot of things I can do with this that I can't seem to do properly with other codecs. One big thing, for example, is interlaced rendering. Yeah, Resolve was never invented for interlace in the first place, because obviously it was invented for film, which will all be progressive. They have added it in and they have improved it in recent versions. So it's better at interlace rendering. But I found when I was trying to render out something as interlaced, I was really struggling to find a format to actually use for it. Because I would render out something that was interlaced, and I'd then try and use it in something else, and it wouldn't be interlaced. And I found Grass Valley remembers all that stuff quite happily. I think this works really well for interlaced. I also think it's just a very good all-round codec. If you're looking at taking some footage out of a program and then using it somewhere else, if you use something like an MPEG-4 file in H.264, can make a very nice looking file, plays fine and it looks fine, but it has actually lost a lot of information. If you're just going to take it and whack it onto YouTube, or you're going to take it and give it to people to watch, that's great. It makes a nice small file that they can carry around and watch, and it looks great. But if you're going to do something with it somewhere else, you're going to pop it into After Effects or do a bit more work on it, then that has lost a lot of information and it'll make your job harder. So ideally, you want to make it into a less compressed version. Now, the most common format is ProRes, which is a QuickTime file, but obviously you'll notice that on a PC, you can't do ProRes. Obviously you can on a Mac. Historically, we couldn't make ProRes in anything on PCs. That changed a few years ago, but it hasn't changed for Resolve. So you can't do ProRes. So what do you actually do? You've got things like DNX, HR and HD, which some of those can do interlace, but they are very restrictive on the sizes. For example, I wanted to take some standard def out of here, whack it into Topaz, upscale it and then bring it back. That's not an option because there's no standard def version in there. And that's the sort of thing I use Grass Valley for, because I can pop in here, use Grass Valley. The HQ version, which is 8-bit, has only got set sizes. The HQX version can do all sorts of different sizes. So like when I'm in a timeline like this, which is 1440 by 1080, it'll quite happily do that. And all I have to do to get it interlaced is tick that, and then generally it's top field first if you're doing anything. The only time I ever use bottom field first is when I'm bringing in DV, but generally it's top field first. I whack that out, it makes a nice file which I can load up in other programs. For example, I can load it up into Topaz quite happily, and this is one of the big things I use it for, is to get it out of here and put it into Topaz. I also, of course, use it to get it out of here and put it into Edius, both of which understand it. If you want to take it into another program, you do have to go onto the interweb, and the simplest place to get it is to go to edius.net, downloads page, and go down here to Grass Valley Codec, and here you can actually download what is basically a very small installer that'll put a codec on, which means you could then read it in Premiere and lots of other programs on a PC. There is one from Mac, but I don't think it works anymore since they changed the way that QuickTime works on a Mac. So this is really a kind of PC only thing. I think it's a good codec to use because it's very efficient. I compared it to ProRes to get the same quality out of it that I would with ProRes. I get smaller files. The ProRes files are the same kind of quality, are twice the size of the Grass Valley files. So it's a very good codec, very good at keeping up the quality. So a very good thing to shuffle things between other programs. Like I say, if you want to use it in Premiere, you've got to download that codec pack. Going into things like StackSrip, which I've used, Virtual Dub, Topaz, they just seem to understand it straight away. Quite a lot of things actually understand it straight away, but something like Premiere needs that codec pack. And of course, if you're coming back into Resolve, if you're just making up an intermediate RAID. Here I'm talking about exporting, but another thing I do from time to time is I will use this thing, render in place. Now particularly I use this when I'm particularly doing fusion compositions. So I've got an awful lot of highly complex effects in a fusion composition. And rather than just leave it so that I render it at exporting time, I like to render it in place so that it's kind of locked. I mean, I've had occasions when, not very often, but sometimes I swap between updates of Resolve and my fusion composition has changed. So I like to, once I've got a fusion composition, which is a complex thing to set up, I like to just render a version of it and shove it onto the timeline. Now for that, I also use Grass Valley AVI files. Another nice thing about them, you see, if you do the Grass Valley HQ ones, is they do also bake in the alpha channel. I've got the studio version of Resolve, and one of the things I do use quite a bit is this thing, the Magic Mask. Now, Magic Mask is where you can just point at something on screen and then it tries to isolate that and track it going across the image. So you can see there, it's actually found my very fuzzy squirrel sitting in the grass, and I could track it and hopefully it would follow him all the way across. Now, I do this a lot sometimes for picking out an object and replacing the background. Not perfect, normally I need to tweak it slightly, but it is actually very good. Now, the only thing about this is that you'll do the tracking, which takes a little bit of time depending on your computer. Now I'm using a 14th generation processor here and a 3060 graphics card, a fairly up-to-date system. And I would track that. I click this little button here which shows me what it's actually selected. And to make it transparent, I would just right-click up here, add an alpha output and link that up. And if I turn that off, you can see what it's actually isolated. I honestly didn't expect it to do such a good job of finding that fuzzy squirrel and all those fuzzy grasses. But yeah, it has done it. And then you can clean it up down here. Maybe I'll do another thing on the Magic Mask at another time. I do that and it works, but I do find just turning off Resolve and maybe coming back into it, if I fiddle with it, it has a tendency to lose that. If I move it from one machine to another, it loses that. You go back to it and you want to do it, you've actually got to go back and track it again. And yeah, the tracking takes time. And what I like to do with that is render in place. Right click, render in place, choose Grass Valley, choose HQX, and it will bake in the transparency. Most of the other versions of files I use in here seem to lose that. At the moment it's against a black background, but if I took that and whacked it up above here, I can see the background and the squirrel on top. And if I do the render in place with the Grass Valley file, that's now baked in and it won't be lost. I can always go back to it, of course. If you do use the render in place and say decompose to original, it'll go back to the original. But I do that, and I found Grass Valley is the best file format to do for that because it keeps the alpha channel. So yeah, Grass Valley, I'd seriously consider trying to use that yourself. Other interesting things I've seen in here, if I'm doing an MP4 file, MP4 is obviously made up of H.264, H.265. I've got this plugin AVC here, which means it does X.264 as well, which is a very nice free way of doing MP4 files. I've got that because I added in an extra free plugin pack. I did a whole video about that, so if you're interested, just go and get hold of that. Only works in the studio version. But with any of these, I can select that file and come down here and say add chapter markers. So if I was to come in here and then put in markers and then export it with chapter markers, they would become chapter markers in the final file. When you've got an MP4 file, it's variable as to what programs actually see them. Normally VLC sees them. I think I had pretty good results with Media Player Classic, but they're useful. It's nice to put chapter markers in there. I wouldn't do it for 4 clips like I've got here, but if I was doing a big long wedding video or something, I might put markers in there and hopefully somebody's player program will actually see them. If it doesn't, that's kind of not Resolve's fault. It's not like the days of DVDs where we had this nice standard format that if everybody can just kept doing that, you'd be okay. No, now we've got MP4 files which can be very variable. We've got millions of different player programs. Some of them see the chapter markers, some don't. I just like the fact that I can stick them in there. Another thing I really like, again, I'm doing a project and I'm collaborating with other people. I've divided it up into scenes. Then for each scene, I make a master AVI file, which I then put into a master timeline. So every time I finish a scene, I make a master AVI file, so it's all baked in and finished. And then I stick that into another timeline where I stitch them all together to make the movie. And I do it as a Grass Valley AVI file because, like I said, it gives me the best quality for the least amount of space. I mean, the other thing that's quite close to Grass Valley is this Cineform one, but I've had the odd hassle in putting Cineform into some of the programs, and I don't think it did the interlacing properly. But although Cineform is something that Premiere will understand natively, whereas for Grass Valley you have to put in the codec. But yeah, I will make up an AVI file, a Grass Valley AVI file, as my master for that scene. If I update the scene, I just replace the master. But if I want to send it to somebody else, I've got to upload it to somewhere so that they can get hold of it and download it. My AVI files are very big. So I also want to make them an MP4 file as a reference, so I can send the reference off to the guy who's doing the audio, and he can shove it on the timeline and put his sound effects against it. So I've got my timeline. I've got it all set up to do a Grass Valley AVI file. I've popped in my variable at the top, so it's going to give it the timeline name, and let's just call it V1. And I want to make an MP4 file out of that as well. So I could obviously just add that to the render queue and then change the settings and add a second one to the render queue. Or I could come up to these little dots here, say create additional output, and now suddenly I've got a 1 and a 2. The first one is showing me the original AVI file that I set in, and a second one that I can change to something else. And I'm going to change that to MP4 files H.264. I'm going to use the NVIDIA encoder. I'm going to put it in a subfolder called MP4, and I'm going to add that to the render queue. And now it's going to make me 2 files at the same time. So let's click the go button, right click on the output, choose open file location. And here you can see I've got Squirrel V1 and I've got MP4, which has got the MP4 version in it. So it did both at the same time. That is a nice little time saver. You could do more. I can go to the second one here and add another output. Oops, accidentally clicked it twice. So I've got 2. So let's just delete that one. And you can click on there and you can make a third one. If I wanted to make a WAV file at the same time as making those 2, I can't. Because you've got audio and video in here, it doesn't let you make a sound only clip. But yeah, you can add in extra outputs. I just update that preset, so now that's in there, saved with all those settings. Another really useful thing I found is exporting subtitles. Rather than having a look at that project, I'm going to open up a new one. It's a video I did recently about what are you going to do because Windows 10 is coming to the end of its life. And I did happen to edit that entirely in Resolve, and I wanted to put subtitles on the thing. Now I'm going to YouTube, so I can't put them with the file itself. I actually have to make the subtitles and then upload them as a separate file. It's actually dead easy with Resolve, and in fact, pretty much I take the subtitles, put them up online and leave it like that. I've already made the subtitles here because this is the one I actually made for that video. But what I did was have the timeline all finished, came up to here and said, create subtitles from audio. I told it to do it in 2 lines, told it that I'm speaking English. And apart from that, I just clicked create. And on this system, it was about 5 minutes and it made all of these subtitles. So I do have some separate videos about creating subtitles in Resolve, but dead easy. And obviously you can come up to the inspector if you want to, and you can change it. But all I did was get it to generate the subtitles. Now I'm going to YouTube, so all the formatting fonts, none of that matters whatsoever. I could have come through here and looked at them and changed them, but it's very time consuming. And I thought they were good enough to use as is, because I didn't have the time to go through 30 minutes of this stuff and make the subtitles as good as they could be. But they look good enough. Most of it's correct. Okay, it doesn't spell my name correctly. And I know if I come up with the word Edius in there, it doesn't spell that correctly. But most of the rest of it is fine. So having done that, I then want to export it. And that's dead easy. I don't go to print to file. There is a subtitle export option in here. So I could come in here and I could say export it as a separate tile and blah, 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 blah. Nope, don't do that. From here, I go File, Export, Subtitle. And obviously it's set to do an SRT file straight away, which is what YouTube would like. But if you do that one, it includes sort of typical web things to make it bold and that kind of thing. What you want to do is click on there and choose subtitles without formatting. So it just produces for you a list of all the words with timecode. So if I go back, have a look at that subtitle, I've set my subtitles to open up in Notepad as a default, and there you can see it literally comes up with a number, time, so that's hours, minutes, seconds, frames, and then thousandths of a frame. I think that's thousandths, but anyway, it comes up with that. Unless I want to come and change some words, which I can either do in Resolve or I can do here, I would literally take that, upload it to YouTube, job done. So it's dead easy, it's very simple. File, export, subtitle, subtitle without formatting. Some of these other things might be other stuff that you need. I know that I was speaking to somebody recently who needed that format because of the way they upload their videos to their website. They needed that particular format. But for YouTube, it's that one. Subtitles without formatting. Dead easy. I also use Edius, and Edius has got a way of doing subtitles with Acoustica, which is okay, but not as accurate as this. Although they have recently also added a free thing called Edius Bat Server, which does subtitles through a free thing called Whisper. So it's all free. If you've got Edius 11, you can use it. It does a very good job of transcribing these subtitles automatically as well. Final thing I want to mention is about exporting stuff. So obviously, add to render queue, Bosch, export, it's done. You want to do it again, obviously just select it and do it again. You can stack up things in here. So it doesn't export stuff in the background. Once it starts exporting, you can't do anything else in Resolve, but you can stack up things. So suppose I wanted to do an AVI version of this, I'd add it into the render queue. Oops. And now I've got two things. If I select it, I can render that one. If I select both of them, I can render all of them. Sometimes I've stacked up about 7 or 8 different things and going to try and select all of them. Even if I click on this little button so my list gets longer, trying to select all of them is hassle. Okay, not the end of the world, just a bit of hassle. But if you don't select anything, it does all of them. So it'll either do the ones you've got selected, or if you don't select anything, it'll do all of them. So in this case, if I click that, it would render both of those. Another useful thing, you might do something and you've finished one project and then you go on to do another one and you want to set everything rendering overnight. Well, obviously here I can only see things from this project, but if you go up to the 3 little dots, it says here, show all projects. So if I click that, suddenly I get all the jobs from all the different projects that I've done. Some of them are completed, some of them aren't. But now you see, I don't select anything, click that, and it'll render absolutely all of them, one at a time. So that's a very useful thing. You can actually do renders from lots of different projects at once, not just the project you're in. Again, it took me a little bit of time to find that, particularly this thing about just don't highlight everything. So literally click on a blank space and it'll render everything in there. Didn't know that one. Of course, you can do things like just the rendered ones, so it only leaves the ones that need to be done. I mean, those are all pretty obvious. It was the not having anything selected and it does all of them that wasn't so obvious for me. Now, obviously, there's a lot more I could go through in here. And maybe at a later stage, I'll talk about the whole data burn-in, which I have used. It's a way of actually sticking stuff onto clips, but I think that deserves its own video. And also, I have mentioned this in one of my videos about upscaling, but I do use this individual clips thing. To save, rather than saving out the timeline as one movie, you can save out each individual clip to be used in something else. I do use that quite a lot, especially when I'm going to Topaz. And I did something about that before, but I might come back and do a special video about that again. But I hope you found that useful and has told you a few things that you didn't realize were there in the exporting part of Resolve. Now, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to see more videos from me, then visit the website, www.dvctraining.co.uk, or have a look here through the YouTube channel. And of course, I got a whole training course on getting to learn the basics of editing in Resolve. And I can do one-to-one training courses in Resolve. And if you're having problems, I can assist you over the phone by remote control. So obviously get in touch if you are interested in any of that. Just email me, david@dvctraining.co.uk. Apart from that, I hope you found this useful and I'll see you next time.